Cool. Another weekly wrap up. Andres, thanks for joining me.
Happy New Year as always, Kaya. I think we should have a pretty good episode today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of events happening soon in the next 1 to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, from some pretty big players in the space. So why don't you give us a quick rundown of who's running these events, what's happening, what's happening there?
Yeah, so events seem to be the topic of interest in March for the digital experience space. So, feature story we have was the Composable Roadshow. This is a uniforms event, and the theme they're going with for this year's event is building the future for business teams and developers. So, Uniform, they're a digital experience composition platform. They empower business teams to quickly build lightning fast and impactful experiences for any channel using content sources without developer support. And for their Composable Roadshow, they want seasoned engineers, architects, marketers from across the digital experience arena to learn more about Uniform and how it accelerates all aspects of digital delivery. So there was one event held earlier this week in London on March 14th, and they've got another one coming up next week in New York on March 21st. So, bit of the agenda that seems to be happening for this event is the keynote is why composable, why now? It's kind of like a state of the market keynote. Composability is a big topic these days. They also got a session on digital experience composition, platform in action, a panel discussion titled "Learn from Your Peers." So, panel discussion with Uniform and I guess some of their partners who are also involved in the event, and then a workshop on the pitfalls of implementing a composable architecture.
Yeah, so I'm glad that's going to be part of the event, the pitfalls of implementing composable architecture, because it's one that could they could have just glossed over, or they could have just not made it a big talking point. But I think it's
Mhm.
important to do this. We've spoken about this before. Companies, enterprise companies who sort of see the benefits of Mac and composable, and the fact of the matter is, unlike a monolithic system or a legacy system where you kind of choose, we're about to discuss Adobe. Let's use Adobe as a example. You choose Adobe, and it's like very much your path is kind of carved out for you, right? The products you're going to use, Adobe's already built them. That's your ecosystem. That's what you're going to build with, and that's that.
Mhm.
When you go the microservices route, you as a company have to then maybe in partnership with a couple of agencies, you have to then pick and choose the best of breed platform that you want to build. That's best for you, best for your legacy systems, best for your customers, and there's a lot more that could potentially go wrong there, right? We've seen other examples of just companies moving too quickly, right? They've got a lot of data and content locked up
Mhm.
in lots of different places. They've tried to move too quickly, and things are breaking, and things are just not going the way they thought. So there's definitely some, you know, pitfalls that should be spoken about and highlighted so that when this transition is made, because the pendulum is definitely swinging away from monolith, away from legacy, and towards Mac. There's no doubt about that. But that shouldn't, silence that discussion, right? That there can be things that go wrong, there can be missteps that can be made,
Mhm.
and that should be highlighted well in advance. So I'm happy that Uniform are addressing that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So yeah, I saw some because it was her letter this week, so I saw some feedback from like some of the uniform team
Yeah,
on LinkedIn. They said, "Well, them said it went well." I would assume that considering it was a uniform event, so I'm interested to see if there's some sort of recap from uniform or any of the other partners. I think like Contentful, Commerce Tools, and a few other agencies were involved as well. So there might be a full recap to come. Yeah, I agree with you. I think like this type of event, the topics that they're discussing, it's like really important for the industry, especially if you get into like the workshop aspect of it. It's really kind of, and if you're talking to the solutions architects, developers, it's
yeah,
not only talking about the pitfalls and dangers, but kind of giving them some things to look out for when they're trying to implement it themselves. Like, okay, these are what you should look for to know if it's going to be right for you or not. So I'm interested to see how that plays out, and also if these type of kind of mini events, like I mentioned, commerce tools are also involved in this event with them. If other vendors start to do some mini events like this, maybe just a couple partners, a couple close, well, a couple partners, couple adjacent vendors as well. Another just could be like a headless CMS and a headless commerce vendor, something along those lines. If they do these type of joint mini events in the rest of 2023.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's a workshop, so I do hope that we get to see like some sort of recording or slides, something like that. Considering it's a workshop, maybe we won't get that, but I'm definitely interested to see what comes out. Hopefully, there'll be
Hmm.
some sort of like blog post recap of that, just to see what those pitfalls were that they highlighted. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to seeing the content that comes out of these two events.
yeah, definitely. Okay, so next up, next week is Adobe Summit. It's Adobe's annual huge conference. It's going to be in Las Vegas. So there's a pre-conference in Vegas starting from the March 19th to the 20th, and then there's the actual conference in Las Vegas from March 21st to 23rd. It's also going to be available virtually, um, and there's a couple key sessions I thought were interesting, particularly from a content management and digital experience standpoint. Trends and inspiration. So this is for senior business decision makers, marketing execs, team leaders, digital marketers, you name it. And they're going to go through the top digital trends in 2023, as well as ways you can accelerating your brand amid macroeconomic climate shifts. So those are two very relevant um, trends and things that we'll be discussing in that session. And then the other session, which I thought was interesting, is content that drives performance. So this is geared towards anyone involved in the content management space. So developers, content authors, marketers, strategists, omni-channel architects, IT teams. And some of the things they'll go through there will be Adobe Experience Manager assets, the top-down innovations, Cisco remembers experience to drive growth with AEM Cloud. So that's kind of how Cisco is using AEM Cloud to create digital experiences, and the journey to driving growth with personalization at scale. I think personalization has been a pretty big topic for Adobe like over the last year or two. So I think that should be an interesting one as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I see you've got some like additional notes down here. So why don't you just like go ahead and address number one, and then we'll just I've got something to say about your thoughts there.
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
the first thing is like, so we don't kind of don't talk about Adobe a whole bunch in terms of the headless space, but the reality is they're arguably the biggest player in the space because the number of companies, especially enterprises that use AEM compared to any other CMS that goes headless, it dwarfs a lot of the competition. And I do remember I do remember seeing a survey or something that one of the headless vendors did, just talking about things like problems that marketers have with like their CMS. And one of the questions just towards the end was like, which CMS are you using? And the difference between AEM and like everyone else, it was almost double. So like they're a huge player in the space. It's gonna be interesting to see how they go about certain things.
For sure, for sure. I mean, when a lot of so a couple of points here. So we've spoken before a few times. When you're in this space, when you're in the headless space, the Mac space, composable space, it can feel like this is the dominant trend and the dominant architecture of choice in across the world, right? And which
Hmm.
is not the case. We're in the infancy of this paradigm shift, right? It's very very
Yep.
early stages. Adobe for sure is one of when you look at a headless CMS talking about them versus monolith, them versus legacy. Adobe is usually one of those unspoken names that they're referring to, right? One of the bogeymen in the room.
Yep.
So, and the reason that is because they've got such a massive market share, as you said. They're a huge company outside of the web content management space. They're a
Hmm.
huge company, huge brand. So they can afford, and they have afforded to, not really
Yep.
address this trend yet, right? We've seen Sitecore go the other direction. They've just jumped straight in, not just addressing it, but
Yep.
investing heavily into pivoting into it. Adobe haven't done that so far, and they've spoken about Mac and headless. I think very very
Hmm.
sporadically and few and far between sort of webinars here and there, if that, right, just a couple of times. And so I think they're in a position where they're still so big and so dominant in the
Yep.
space. They just don't
Yep.
have to right now. They've got their own ecosystem, a huge customer base. They just simply don't need to. They just don't need to address this relatively small threat right
Yeah.
now. But that threat is growing. That threat has a lot of steam behind it, and more importantly, that threat has a lot of ROI for users of
Yeah.
that architecture, this Mac architecture, this composable architecture. There's substance there. It's not just a trend. So eventually they will have to address it, and they will begin to address it. I feel like Sitecore. I just feel like they've got a bit more time before they need to,
Hmm.
or maybe that's what they feel. That being said, they're gonna be
Yeah.
addressing the top digital trends of 2023 it's kind of difficult to do that without mentioning the whole Mac composable microservices thing, in my in my
Yeah.
opinion. But of course, that's coming from us, who is like, we've got our heads buried in this space. There's of course other digital trends. I suspect they're going to not mention
Yeah.
anything like that in this
Mhm.
event. I
It
just
is.
don't think I don't think it's part of the strategy just yet. I think they're just monitoring it and focusing on their existing ecosystem. They may be working on something in behind the scenes, but I just can't see them openly
Mhm.
challenging it or openly embracing it anytime soon, based on what I've seen from them so far. But I could be
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm interested to see what happens because I think it was last year at Sitecore Symposium when Sitecore kind of just they've been leading into it, Sitecore, in terms of like mock, composable, and kind of pivoting, but then they kind of just like unveiled, boom, three new Sitecore products, three new everything kind of shifting towards that composable thing, and they just kind of doubled down on it. And like I think like we talked about the sheer size of Adobe, but like Summit is huge. It's the huge con for the entire Adobe brand. Summer 2022 had over 100,000 attendees between like partners, practitioners, whoever. Like, so they always release new products and partnerships. It's actually not even just like a conference. Like, I know
It's
we
crazy.
say this sometimes in different events, like something called like a star-studded event, but it really is. Like they bring in actors, they got NFL players like Peyton Manning, Demar Hamlin. Like, it's such a huge like just like a spectacle. I think it's gonna be so.
Yeah,
It's gonna be interesting if they talk about mod composal in any shape, way, or
yeah,
form. It could be very maybe game changing isn't the right word, but it could have a huge impact if they start mentioning stuff as well.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, and I think again that's part of the reason why I probably won't right now, right? I think it's just like it's a little bit too
Yeah.
new and not, I don't think it's eating away at their market share in a in a way that they're panicking too much right now. Because if they were,
Yeah.
they'd probably look at Sitecore strategy and try to emulate that. But like I said, I think it will. I think it's on its journey, and I think they probably know that. But again, you mentioned something interesting here, just the sheer size of their brand.
Yeah.
This is why they're not rushing to do it, right? They can bring in these I guess I'll call them A-list celebrities because their brand is just so
Yeah.
far-reaching, right? Again, it's just not far beyond the web content management
Yeah.
scene. They've got their fingers in so many different pies via sponsorships, via technology contracts, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That they've got this reach, this huge reach across
Yeah.
different industries, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at maybe the biggest player in the headless space, they're like a baby next compared to that brand wise. And that just
Mm-hmm.
tells you, it paints a picture of sort of how far there is to go. But yeah, I feel like
Yeah.
if Adobe was to mention it, they were to come out and say Mac and say composable and say headless, that would change things. That would accelerate, I think,
Yeah.
research into that. And it may not work out into Adobe's favor right now, which is why I think they won't do it. Um, but yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I said before, I feel like they will do it at some point. I just don't think it'll be now. Okay. Anything
All
else?
right. Well, let's see. No, I think that's it. What we got for today.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to the content, the highlights, and the blog content going to come out of these like couple of events. So that'll be interesting to keep tabs on. Other than that, we are not quite ready to announce our news, but hopefully next time we get together, we'll announce some interesting news for the space as well. But until then, Andres, have a good week.
Yep.